Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susan McKenzie, CEO at the ESF, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this ESF-hosted event, Behind the Mask, Stories from the Emergency Services Frontline. I'm speaking with you from Boon Wurrung land on the Mornington Peninsula, and I'd like to acknowledge those people as the traditional owners of these beautiful lands and waterways, and pay my respects to all First Nation elders, past and present. We have such a diverse group of people online today. We've had more than 350 people register, in fact. We've got representatives from all Victorian emergency management agencies. We've got a group of paramedic students. And we've got people from many organisations which support the sector to do its work. Businesses like Gallagher Bassett, Police and Emergency Services Health, WorkSafe, Motorola, Australian Defence Apparel, Telstra, Data3, Happy Hygiene, and ESSS Super. But for many of you, I know this will be your first interaction with ESF. We're a small not-for-profit which specialises in mental health and wellbeing for the emergency management sector in Victoria. We don't replicate what agencies are responsible for as employers, but we use our expertise to support them by bringing evidence, innovation, and leading practice to help improve mental health outcomes for the 125,000 people, paid and volunteer, in our sector who protect our community, like they are doing today. Our focus is not on treating sick people, and sadly there are way too many in that category in our sector. We're about prevention and preventing people getting sick in the first place. And we do this in three ways. We strengthen mental health leadership at all levels because this is central to creating a mentally healthy workplace. We prepare people to be well beyond their career in emergency management because after a lifetime of service, identity and experience as a first responder, it can be a very tough transition. We drive new approaches to prevention and early intervention because if we get that right, we'll have less sick people. Sharing stories of lived experience is an important way of educating. For people within the sector, stories build understanding and confidence to recognise symptoms and seek help early if they need it. And for people outside the sector, it helps them to appreciate that working in emergency management is more than a job, and it can take a terrible personal mental toll. I'd now like to welcome a very well-known storyteller, John Sylvester, renowned age journalist, who constantly observes our sector and is well placed to consider what it means to be on the front line as an emergency service responder as our community struggles with COVID. We've invited John to share stories with four people today. Firstly, Acting Assistant Commissioner Deb Robertson from Victoria Police, who spent 3 months from June to August in the hot seat in charge of VicPol's COVID response. We also have Jess Pearce, AV paramedic and team leader in the west of Melbourne, which of course has been a hotspot for COVID. Later, we'll bring in Joe Park from Red Cross, who is a field logistics officer for Red Cross up in Shepparton, where his focus was on getting food to those who need it. And then Sean Caulfield, who's a unit controller with the Lilydale SES, who in the middle of the pandemic led his unit's response to those terrible June storms in the Dandenong. So essentially a disaster surrounded by COVID. So I'm going to hand over to you now, John, and say thank you very much for joining us. And I look forward to the conversations like everybody else is.
Thanks very much, Susan. It's probably a good week just to reflect. Just a few years ago at this time, we'd be all preparing for the grand final, possibly having lunches. The city would be upbeat. Instead, right now, we've got probably 1,000 very angry people in the city protesting. Some of them are union members, some from the building industry and others hangers-on. That means that today a large number of young policemen and women who were probably going to work in their stations have been dragged out into the city, and they have been standing at Parliament House and now at Flinders Street, not knowing whether or not they're going to have to go hands-on, whether or not they're going to be assaulted, and whether their actions are going to be second-guessed. There's another line of the mounted branch who love their horses who'll be wondering whether or not they're going to be in a confrontation. Members of the public order response team, some of them armed with guns that can fire capsicum rounds or projectiles, wondering if they're going to have to fire upon their fellow citizens. And senior officers who will have to make those decisions, knowing those actions will be second guessed by some who'll say they weren't aggressive enough or they were too aggressive. Even if there's no confrontation, the police there, their heart rates will be up now, they'll be sweating, they'll be wondering what's to come, and if nothing happens, they'll go home still to have broken sleep and still wonder whether they'll have to do it tomorrow. On Saturday, we had up to 50 who just graduated from the police force to do good. I've been to those sort of graduations, and you see their shiny smiles and sparkling eyes as they want to go out and help their community. And their first action was to go hands-on with people who just wanted to hurt them, strangers. Some of those demonstrators will go home. If their homes are burgled, they'll ring the very police that they were spitting at and yelling at. Or if in this bad weather, a tree falls on their house, they'll call upon their fellow citizens from the SES to help them. Or if they're hurt, they'll contact the ambulance service, expecting and hoping and getting first-class service to assist them in their time of need. So of all the emergency services and the volunteers, the thing that connects them is routinely they run to situations where others run from. And their code is to be at their best when perhaps we're at their worst. The two first guests that we've got, I'm really looking forward to talking to, is Deb Robertson from VicPol and Jess McGowan from Ambulance Victoria. Both have had a really, really strong role in this sort of bizarre situation that we call COVID. Deb, thank goodness it's you and not me. You've been hands-on with this COVID situation for some months. I'm sure you didn't sign up for this sort of stuff, but what were the immediate challenges for you?
Hi, John, and to everyone that is listening in. Well, it's interesting because I've spent 38 years, a privilege to serve for 38 years, but there's been times along that journey where, yeah, you do stop and reflect about, is this what I joined up to do? But COVID, I think, caught everybody by surprise. From policing people to not be 5 kilometres from their home to, you know, some wild rides with directions that change overnight, and sitting in that state police control centre, waiting and trying to read it, interpret it, to see how we can get the message out to our members best so that we cause the least amount of disruption, but also ensure that we, you know, preserve the peace and protect life and property. I mean, that's never too far away from many of us.
And Deb, it's created a lot of stress for the police themselves, who never thought they'd be going to coffee shops and saying, do you mind moving on?
Yeah, well, yeah, or in fact themselves getting caught at a tier 1 coffee shop, which has happened a lot, particularly up at headquarters there. But yeah, it's a really good point, John. And it's, you know, I don't think there's ever been a more apt time than the expression that the police are the community, but the community are also the police. And we've had to rely a lot on our community, the eyes and ears, to tell us what's going on, but also, you know, tread warily, because we generally would, you know, deal with maybe 5 to 10% of the population that choose to bend the law or blatantly ignore the law. And now we're, you know, probably not dealing with about 5 or 10%, because all of these CHO directions, you know, apply to people that have never probably dealt with the police other than a victim or a witness.
And your members are also, as you say, members of the community. So they've got the same battles with homeschooling, isolation, partners perhaps losing their jobs.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. I mean, it's interesting to read the narrative for our policing response over the last 18 months, because we've gone from friend to foe to friend again to foe. It's been really hard to keep up, and there's not one police officer out there that's looking for any sympathy, because we absolutely understand that the community is doing it hard. Just a little bit of understanding every now and then would go a long way to help support our members.
You did a Churchill Fellowship which looked at trying to get a little bit more flexibility in the workforce, particularly, I imagine, to improve the gender balance. And has that helped you in this COVID time where some people, even in the police department, have been working from home?
Yeah, probably has. I think the Churchill for me was more about to think outside the box and not blue shirt think, because I'm pretty institutionalised with 38 years in Victoria Police, but I needed to think differently. I needed to look at things differently. And my career has been a little bit different. Being a woman, when I joined, there were only 8% of women in Victoria Police. We now sit at just over 30. For some, that might not seem like a great achievement, but for someone like me, it's amazing that, almost 1 in 3 now is a female in our organisation. And working from home has had its own challenges, but its own reward to keep our members up and engaged.
Took a long time for the police department, for the penny to drop, that actually to get out of day-to-day policing for a period of time actually refreshes you. I found some members who were probably getting to the point of being cynical, where they thought everyone was a crook or a victim, to actually get out, either to work outside or to do family duties, just reminds them that the community isn't full of the black hats and the white hats.
It's really true, actually. And the other thing is to remind yourself never to take anything personally. I mean, people, you summed it up beautifully at the start. We do unfortunately see people at their worst, their most dangerous, their worst hating self of not necessarily the police, but whatever life's dished them up. And our job really is to just go back to those basic principles of preserving the peace and protecting life and property. And for me, I've just not strayed too far away from that. And I think most members would, be comfortable to say the same.
Jess, how has the job changed for you in your time there? I mean, I didn't ever think I'd live to see the day where there had to be laws passed to protect paramedics, from assault. People who are absolutely the medical cavalry.
Yeah, I think the pandemic sort of brought out the best and the worst in some people. As an ambulance service for us, there's been a lot of changes in the last 18 months. It's, we're turning up to patients now who we normally try and gain rapport with smile, welcoming face, hand on the shoulder, walking into these jobs now with face covered, eyes covered, gloves on. It's very hard to sort of go up to that person who's got someone on the floor, who's injured, and gain a rapport and walk past them and show that we're there to, help and support the patients. People are at their wits' end in the community, and people at work as well, there's no outlet at the moment. There's nowhere to go to the gym or go for, whether they're rock climbers or gym goers or social, outlets. I think people in the community at the moment are at their wits' end as well. So it doesn't take much for their bad day to sort of trigger a bit of anxiety or anger. And unfortunately, sometimes when we turn up, we can be at the back end of that.
You get the lash. It's interesting you talked about the gym and rock climbing, even particularly for your own members. There's a book on emotional survival for emergency services by a fellow called Kevin Gilmartin, and he's a trained psychologist and ex-police officer, but he doesn't get lost in psychobabble. He makes it so important that a physical outlet to get rid of that is just is vital. He said everyone's got a sort of bucket upon which you fill with stress, and everyone's bucket's different, and it can be filled with one incident like Hoddle Street or 1,000 incidents, but you just need that outlet at the bottom to let it move on. For you now, with 220 people under you, how do you try and monitor the mental well-being of your own people?
Yeah, it's difficult at the moment, and you know, we're definitely looking at things at the moment that we can try and take away from people to reduce that cognitive load on our staff. You know, what are things that we can, you know, take away from them that they don't have to worry about at the moment? You know, trying to get people off on time from work, making sure they get meal breaks at work, and things like that are really important. We know they're coming to work with a full bucket, so to speak, and you know, they're expected to turn up and turn out and go to case after case and have that worry of going to patients who are COVID positive, people who are a bit angrier at the moment, and things like that. So it's about us trying to look after, you know, our staff and trying to reduce the load on them, knowing that, you know, we still need them to turn out and go to job after job.
You know, we've seen story after story and study after study, which shows the increased number of calls for both police and paramedics for mental health issues. Is that an increased burden where you're not, you know, you're medically trained, but how do you deal with people who are having psychological episodes?
Yeah, I mean, for us, I know we've had a significant increase in mental health presentations. Yeah, we're seeing over 200 mental health emergencies a day. So, you know, we've put a system in place in AV at the moment where it's called teleprompt. So we're actually trying to do secondary triage for some of our mental health calls, trying to keep them out of emergency departments when we can. So we link them up on a phone with a mental health clinician and see if we can get them support, whether it's self-care at home, referral to a, you know, psychiatrist or a psychologist, or whether they need to come into hospital. So we've actually set up a whole department with specialised mental health clinicians to try and support us in being able to, you know, support that increase in demand for patients in the community with mental health.
It's a really good point you made about wearing the mask. Deb, the same would be with police, that you can be wearing the uniform with all the gear on it, but a smile or a twinkle in the eye can make all the difference. But if you've got a mask, it looks pretty daunting.
Sorry, John, you just kind of buffered out on me, but I think I got the gist of the question. Yeah, that's exactly right. And you raised, you know, in your opening again about our young members that were out on the front line on Saturday with a nasty come what protest. And I've just had a text through now that says there's about 2,000 there in the city now. So, you know, our members will be pouring in from wherever, as close as they possibly can, to try and hold the line, for want of a better term. And I, you know, hate to digress a bit, but I do remember in the mid-1980s that I was one of those young members holding the line for a BLF demonstration. So, you know, things have changed somewhat in the style, in the way they demonstrate, but some of the tactics still remain the same. So thankfully our tactics, our options have expanded, which is a good thing.
It's interesting you say that, because I've spoken to a number of senior members, and every one of them has reflected on whether it be BLF was particularly cognizant in many of their minds. So it obviously sticks in the memory, those sort of events, because yeah, for the poor young people who were at Richmond, you know, some of them were very, very angry and disappointed and concerned. I spoke to a pathologist once who had done a lot of war crimes, so he'd been involved with, you know, literally thousands of cases of exhumations. And I said, how possibly can you do this? And he said, as long as you believe what you're doing matters, you can deal with the stress. Jess, particularly with your people going again and again and again and again to these events, you know, how do they just maintain, you know, their motivation?
Yeah, I think we're lucky as an ambulance service, and Deb, you know, you're in the same boat where, you know, most of us go into this sort of organisation or this vocation because it's a job we get to do. It's not a job that we've got to do. So we're lucky we've got that behind us, because, you know, our paramedics, you know, they've chosen to do this job and they want to go. Yes, at the moment they're tired, definitely, but, you know, every different patient they go to has called for a different reason. And I think a reset after every job to say, right, next patient, it's a different case, it's a different experience. Majority of people we go to to, you know, we turn up and it's the first time they've ever called an ambulance. So we don't want to sort of put everyone in the same bucket, and we want people to know that when we do come, that they're going to have a good experience, and that we're there to help, so that, you know, if they do need us again, they'll call again. But I think, you know, a reset after every job, you know, whether that job that you went to previously didn't go the way you hoped, or, you know, it might have been a situation where you needed, you know, Victoria Police to come and help you out or something like that. Next job, new patient, and you try and give everyone the best experience.
But yeah, and obviously in the vast majority of your cases, it's a happy result. It's not an angry person, it's a frightened person, a sick person who gets help and recovers. So, you know, there must be an amazing buzz in your people being able to say, well, if we hadn't turned up, that person may well have died.
That's right. Yeah, definitely. And, you know, our guys, and, you know, we get a lot of, you know, satisfaction from helping people. And, you know, that's why we go out job after job, whether it's, you know, old Nana with a broken hip who's just grateful that, you know, someone's found her and helped her and, you know, given us a pain relief, or, you know, a lady delivering a baby on the side of the freeway, scared parent with a, you know, baby that's choking. There's so many cases where, you know, just having that gratitude from people and being able to help people and see a turnaround in their anxiety levels once you walk in the door, that's definitely, you know, something that feeds you to keep going job after job.
And did you say that it was 8% police female police when you joined?
Yeah, 1983, John, 8%, and actually was a detective in 1989, and there were 1% of us.
Oh, wow.
so that's even more isolating, but anyway.
So take us back to the academy back in the early 80s. What was it like with such a male-dominated organisation?
Well, I know women only wore skirts, so there was no pants for us. It wasn't until Mick Miller actually decided that perhaps pants weren't the devil in disguise. So yeah, it was a very different time. Our equipment belt was different, but you know, one thing that's never changed, John, and this is where it doesn't differentiate between gender, is your ability to communicate. And I think Jess has summed it up really well as well. But it's our number one tool, even in those hostile environments that our members are finding themselves in right now. It really can, you know, turn on a dime depending on what you say and how you say it. So we can have our batons, we can have our capsicum, we can have our rubber bullets, but it's pretty easy, and pardon the pun, but to piss someone off pretty quickly with the wrong comment at the wrong time.
Well, the generation before you, I think they had to carry their guns in the handbag.
Well, I actually did have to carry my gun in the handbag at the start, but I was one of the lucky ones because back then they had women's divisions. And when I graduated, there'd been about 12 months, 2 years out in stations doing general duty. So I never actually had to sit in the women's division that looked after women and children. Yeah, so I went to the good old streets of Fitzroy in 1983, and that was, a real eye-opener.
Well, that's a sharp learning curve there.
A very steep one, yeah.
It's interesting because even up until recently, it was never written, but it was the sort of areas that were considered jobs for males, and of course, one-man stations.
Correct.
Is an example, but I think there were 3 females who went into those one-person stations, and the family violence reports skyrocketed because local women who didn't feel that they could report largely their husbands to the local male copper who may have drunk at the same pub or, you know, supported the same local footy side, they weren't reporting it. When females went there, they felt that they could. So there was actually an upside.
Well, there's been plenty of upsides where it's been beneficial gender-wise, both ways. But it's interesting because, as you know, Victoria Police is nearly 6 years post that VERIOC review that came out and painted a very bad picture. And they've done a tremendous amount of work trying to address some of those issues, and we've still got a way to go. But I did listen to Kristen Hilton, who was head of Victorian Equal Opportunity Human Rights Commission and has just wound up, and she actually said Victoria Police will know when they've got to equality when it's unremarkable to be a woman in the organisation. And I actually couldn't agree with her more.
I certainly think that's the case, and your area in organised crime is a prime example of that, that within the crime department now, detectives are, it's just about how you perform.
Correct. And it should be. And I mean, the understanding of diversity is about thought and experience, not the Y or X chromosome, as I say to a lot of my peers. Yeah.
Well, Sarah Morse, I think she won Detective of the Year because she was able to solve the murder of Graham Kennebra, which was a piranha job, which was, what, 18 years old. Just a brilliant piece of police.
Correct.
Which
yeah.
just
I mean, I do, you know, I used to say too, when I was fortunate enough to investigate at times, that I was a paid sticky beak, and women do that very, very well. No disrespect to my peers. So, yeah, we don't let go.
And Sarah, are you getting enough people who want to be paramedics? Is it still a job that people aspire to?
Yeah, definitely. It's a very, very popular in the universities. They're putting out probably more graduate paramedics than we can actually accommodate through recruitment. So that's always great for us. I know paramedic graduates, they also go over to England, New South Wales, you know, around Australia as well. So there's definitely enough coming out of university, which is great. Very popular, and you know, the score to get in is a lot higher now than it used to be as well. You know, it's driven up by that popularity too.
Fantastic. And let's just hope you're not needed in the city this afternoon. Let's hope that everything just dissipates and people can yell a while and hold their signs up and then go home for a roast dinner.
Let's hope so.
I hope so too.
Yeah. Thanks very much to both of you. I think it's been really insightful into both the challenges and the pluses of both professions.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.
Talk soon.
Bye.
Next up, we've got the volunteers. These are people who have an altruistic a sense of duty. Joe Park, particularly from the Australian Red Cross, and Sean Caulfield from the SES. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, John.
I've got you, Joe.
Yep, you've got me here, John.
Oh, I got you both. Joe, why in the first place did you volunteer for the Red Cross?
John, I think Red Cross is a very unique brand, a very unique organisation. It obviously has those key pillars of and fundamental principles of neutrality, impartiality. They really struck out to me from a young age. It has a great history. For anybody who doesn't know the history of Red Cross, it's definitely worth a read, and some great resources online about the Battle of El Solferino. So yeah, from a very young age, John, I was drawn to Red Cross and doing some humanitarian aid work overseas with several organisations, including Médecins Sans Frontières.
Well, what was your background? I mean, you just didn't wake up one day and say, "Oh, I'll join the Red Cross." You know, it's not like joining a footy side. What were you doing?
Yeah, John, I think the simplest way I could answer that is I saw volunteer agencies such as Red Cross and such as the State Emergency Service that Sean's involved with from a young age, responding to emergencies in my part of the world in Central Victoria. So responding to floods, and that stuck in my mind from, I believe I was 10 or 12 years old, and seeing the humanity that those volunteers had and the way they reached out and supported their communities with simple things like sandbagging and providing food and water to those who had been forced to evacuate from their homes. I believe it's those experiences as a young kid that stuck with me, and I wanted to be part of it.
Well, there's one thing providing bacon and egg sandwiches at Shepparton. It's a long way to go to West Africa. So what were you doing over there?
Yeah, John, I completely acknowledge. I think it's partly my sense for adventure, sense for keen to have an experience, keen to experience a new culture and a new country. I don't shy away from that. I went to West Africa and also the Middle East with Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, to support in logistics roles. And that was really fulfilling work and really gave me an opportunity to develop professionally. But it was also a great adventure, John. Absolutely. I think.
Where were you in West Africa?
I was in Nigeria, John, and also Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast.
And what specifically was your role there?
I was a general logistician, John, so known as a jack of all trades, there to support national staff. National staff are a really important part of what MSF do, but there is a need for expatriates to be there to ensure that money is spent in the right way, and that we can bring some external expertise to support those national staff to do the work on the ground. So we did things like make sure generators were running so that our hospitals could function, making sure our drivers were trained and skilled so that they could drive our patient transport vehicles, and so many other things.
So that's a world away again from sort of turning up at Shepparton during COVID. And for somebody in leafy Melbourne, it seems amazing that you had to actually organise food for somewhere like Shepparton. What was the circumstances there?
Yeah, Shepparton was a really unique situation, John, and unlike anything we've had in Victoria in recent history for sure. Shepparton, for those who aren't aware, when it had an outbreak, a COVID-19 outbreak in late August, ultimately that led to something like 20,000 or a third of the Great Shepparton in some form of isolation. So that's a really big hit to that community. It also had many flow-on effects with simple things like there may have been food in town, but getting it on shelves and getting supermarket staff so people could get food deliveries through collect. So that really shut down to some extent for a number of days in Shepparton, with many people at home with very little support to get food to their door and to ensure they had simple things like something to cook the kids, baby formula, nappies, those kinds of things. So I can go on a bit further, John, but essentially that was the challenge we were faced with.
And Sean, you're fourth generation in the SES, so...
Oh, not quite. I made a typo. I'm third generation. My son's fourth generation. But,
okay, well,
that's right. No,
I want to talk to him then.
I gave you the wrong info. Yeah, I mean, look, that's kind of how I came. I was brought up around that. My dad and my grandfather were, and my uncle actually were also all members of what was civil defence back through the late 60s into the early 70s, morphing into what we now know as Victoria SES as of 1975. And for me, it was just I would be hanging around at the station when my dad was down there during even during the Ash Wednesday fires. I mean, look, I was 12 at the time, but I was around just seeing what SES was doing in that, and those roles were all support roles and similar roles that we play now in a bushfire type scenario. So not really our main roles, but that just it just was something that I felt I was always going to do, not out of obligation, but just because it just feels like it's the right thing to do. And that's giving back to our local community and the broader Victorian and potentially Australian community is just I know it just feels like something that's just right, I suppose.
So you would have grown up with your dad just getting up in the middle of the night, putting his gear on and going?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, back in my dad, he was actually part of the first cadre of paid staff in SES in the mid 70s, and then left that and went to Victoria Police for 8 or 9 years. So he couldn't quite work out what he was going to do. But yeah, they were always, pages were going off and people were leaving in the middle of the night, and it was just normal in our house. So a bit like why my son, I think, followed, of his own accord, certainly with no influence from myself or my wife into that. It was entirely his decision to do that. So,
yeah, well, you might have been young during Ash Wednesday, but the circumstances there and the loss of life, and it literally was equivalent to a nuclear bomb going off in the area.
Yeah, well,
that was done.
Yeah, well, we lived in Kilsyth at the time, right at the base of the Dandenong. So literally from our backyard, we could see the whole, western face of Mount Dandenong on fire, basically. So for us, we weren't in it, but it was certainly very real to us, even as kids, living through that dust storm as we were coming home at the end of, the end of 1982 there, and then heading into the Ash Wednesday fires, and then being right smack bang in the middle of the Black Saturday fires as well. So
yeah, well, that dust storm was like the end of the world. It's just
it was. I'm sure I've seen movies, apocalypse type movies that have had what seems like similar scenes. It was scenes. It was quite surreal as a 12-year-old.
So, and your full-time job is paramedic?
Yep.
So you are a glutton for punishment, clearly.
Yeah, it would seem, yes.
The storm that went through the Dandenongs.
Yeah.
I've got a friend up there, and sort of, I've got to admit that I just didn't realise how savage it was until he told me that 60 gum trees had come down on his property.
Yeah.
And these were massive trees, and the stumps in his house were damaged, even though it didn't hit the house. That's how. And he just said, we were certain we were going to die that night.
Yeah, I mean, look, we cover of Mount Dandenong, we cover probably 2/3 of it, and the other third's covered by the Emerald Unit predominantly. But we've got a saying that there's no such thing as a small tree in Kalorama, because they're all huge. I was actually on the mountain that night, actually in Kalorama at one point, and it's probably the scariest thing I think I've ever done in the 30+ years I've been doing, either this and with my career in AV. It was like a cyclone, but outside of the tropics. And for whatever reason, it didn't garner a lot of media coverage. I think partly because there was just no infrastructure, there was no mobile phone coverage. And in this day of social media, people weren't able to take a quick photo and upload to their Facebook the level of devastation. And it took a few days before it became evident that, the amount of trees down, the amount of infrastructure damage was just something that we probably haven't really seen, certainly not in the Dandenongs, and we certainly really don't generally see in Victoria. We had a tornado go through Mildura, and we had a tornado event up in Benalla a few years ago, but the effects were relatively isolated. This, had 8,000 or 9,000 people without power, and a lot of those people had some level of damage to their homes. While some of them were able to be occupied, a lot of them weren't. And it just took a bit of time for that info to filter out, I think, to the general population of just how bad it was.
Maybe because we know the Dandenongs, maybe because we drive up there, there's almost familiarity. It's almost treating it not as the pristine bush it is, but as a suburb of Melbourne.
Definitely. And I mean, even now, I drove across in that area yesterday for work, and still remarked at just how much more light there is on the ground, because there's so many fewer big trees that are upright. They're all on the ground. And it's fundamentally changed the feel and the landscape up there, and it won't be the same again, because some of those trees are 50, 80, 100 years old that have come down.
And I imagine it will have affected the confidence of some of the locals.
Very much so. I mean, and that's what led into our and you can see that from the relief centre that we helped manage at Kalorama in the early stages before we handed it off to the other agencies to manage long term, is that speaking with those locals, that was the thing. They couldn't. A lot of them couldn't go to some of the more official relief centres because they just physically had no way of getting there, either because the road was blocked and they were using heavy machinery to open them, and it took days, or their cars were under trees. So they had no way of getting there. So just interacting with those people, you could see that they were nervous and they were frightened. And, the slightest gust of wind had people looking up at trees to see whether, another tree was going to come down. So their threshold for what is usually a community that's pretty resilient to wind, because it gets windy up there all the time. But yeah, they were very shaken by it.
Joe, you had some involvement up there as well?
During this storm event, John?
Yes.
Yeah, I was part of the virtual incident management team, so working remotely, but we certainly had a big involvement, Red Cross, in both the Dandenong Ranges and over towards Hepburn and the Daylesford area, Trentham as well, with volunteers on the ground from Red Cross providing psychological first aid, which is something every volunteer in Red Cross is trained to provide psychological first aid. So that's something we do really well.
That's really good to hear. I wasn't aware of that, because we understand that you're going to be there for the packages, the food packages, that immediate triaging, if you like. So what do you do in that sort of mental health space?
Yeah, John, I'm glad you brought it up. So as I said, everybody with Red Cross must be trained in psychological first aid and providing that. So we had volunteers on the ground reaching out, and they were doing door knocking over a number of days and weeks in the affected areas, essentially having a conversation, checking in on people. Obviously, each agency has its strengths. The SES did an amazing job in clean up and response, and that's that aspect of it. In the days and weeks after the event, John, often people just need a conversation. They need to feel like they can be listened to maybe release some frustration, talk about their experience, and be connected with some other assistance if needed. So Red Cross play a role there as well.
I'm sure you would have seen that many, many times. The adrenaline, if someone's lost their house, whether it be from storm damage or a fire, they're often almost up and about. The adrenaline's still there. They're talking, a million to the mile. But then all of a sudden, a day or 2 or 5 days later, when they're going through, the devastation, and maybe see something which is a child's toy or a burnt out picture frame, and the realization that all those memories have gone. And I've never seen anyone cry over a colour TV.
Yeah, I think the thing with part of maybe the reason it didn't get as much coverage, I think too, but I think the thing with storm damage is that you tend not to lose absolutely everything. Lots of things might be damaged, but a lot of things are still there. There's usually some things that are salvageable, and I think that helps people a little bit, because even when the biggest of trees comes down and takes out your entire house, there's usually something, as opposed to in that fire situation where you just get left with a chimney and maybe a tin full of half-charred photographs. But it's still really challenging for a lot of people to, that couple of days later, when that adrenaline's worn off, when the fatigue is really setting in, and we had a lot of our members in our own debrief talked about their interactions with people in that time, and just the stopping and having that conversation with people, just to give them a bit of an opportunity to say, what they feel and get it off their chest. Even though all of our members aren't trained in psychological first aid, it's still just being that listening ear, and it's just another role that we can add to the actual response stuff that we do to help people.
Yeah, I think Ash Wednesday may have been a turning point there, because there are a number of people who were devastated by it, who would admit that it was years later that they finally acknowledged that, there'd been a great psychological toll. And it wasn't just about rebuilding a house or buying a new car. Joe, is there any particular case, a question without notice, is there any particular case that knocked you about, that left you a little bit despondent or shaken?
Oh, good question, John. And without, off the top of my head, no, but definitely the answer is yes. I believe I've got better over the years at controlling my adrenaline and learning to take a breath. Goes back to that, the topic you spoke a little bit earlier with Jess about, from Ambulance Victoria, keeping your cup full. I'm a lot more aware of that these days, keeping my cup full so that I can be my best to help people during emergencies. But also we need to always think about the next emergency. COVID won't be the last emergency. We haven't experienced the last bushfire or flood. So it's about looking after ourselves today, providing what we can. But we need to be there in the long term as well and look after ourselves. So there has been instances of knock me about, but if I could say one thing out of the recent experience in Greater Shepherd, the good news stories really kept my motivation levels up. Delivering baby formula and essential items to a family of 5 or 6 children, a single parent who didn't have very little support at all. Yeah, I mean, if you can see a smile through a mask, I think that's probably the time I've seen it, John.
Yeah. Sean, what about you? Was there any particular one that you felt overwhelmed, or?
I wouldn't say overwhelmed. I mean, there's lots of stories in that setting of people losing, you know, livelihoods, and we had a job that we responded to with the Emerald Unit. They supported us to someone who was trapped under their house, you know, in the height of the storm, and you know, my crews along with the Emerald guys, you know, basically cut our way into this, you know, through all the trees across the roads, and loaded this patient up into the back of the ambulance and escorted the ambulance down off the mountain, and it took sort of nearly 3 hours to do all of that. I had the opportunity, I was lucky enough to speak to the family members of that individual and to hear the gratitude in their voices, you know, going, we all thought we were going to die here with all the trees falling down. Why on earth would you volunteer to, and I mean, not volunteer in the fact that we're not paid, but why would you, you know, deliberately come up here to help us when it was so dangerous? And that, you know, makes you proud of what you do and why we do it. But I think the flip side of that was all the good news stories, as Joe was just saying. You know, we ran essentially a little supermarket up at the Kalorama Oval, and having this lovely little old lady come in her, you know, blanket as a bonnet type arrangement, because that's really all she had left. Everything else was wet. And we had an outstanding community response in terms of our requests for food and stuff to supply to people. And we probably had nearly 600 litres of UHT milk. And she's like, I'll just take one in case someone else needs one. And it's like, you can take 3, so you don't have to come back tomorrow. And just little things like that, and seeing the community, you know, pull together with other little things like looking out for each other. You know, she just didn't want to take it away from someone else who might have also needed it. I think those are the things that help fill your cup back up again by, you know, giving you that faith in the world, if you like, that there are good things to be had out of bad situations sometimes.
Sean, I don't think you could have summed it up any better right across the emergency service spectrum, that it's about the victories and not dwell necessarily on the defeats.
100%.
And a cancer doctor must think of the people they've saved, not the people they've lost, that they have made a difference. And as I said earlier on, that is, in my experience, what keeps both the volunteers and the professionals in all these different fields going, is the view that you have made a difference. And an organisation like this, the ESF, and the vast majority of people know and acknowledge that. And it's fantastic to know that all the different organisations are trying to spend a little bit more time being proactive in the area of mental health, because you know, right across the board in private industry as well, people are saying, oh, you know, we've got mental health clinicians, we've got experts on hand, but better not to create the wound rather than call for the Band-Aid.
Absolutely. And it's about giving people strategies and skills to manage it before it becomes a problem as best as you can. You can't always avoid it, but I think, you know, equipping people before it becomes a problem and allowing them to identify, equipping them to identify, and then allowing them the opportunity to access help if they need it, I think is really important. I think we've done that. I know SES do it well. I think AV does an exceptional job of doing that. So I can speak from my work perspective. I think we do that incredibly well.
You see it at both ends. Sean and Joe, thanks very much for joining us. I think you've given us a real insight into 2 other areas of emergency service.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having us.
Great. Now we're going to finish with a short video which will actually explain the work of ESF much better than I can.
In 2009, we had a series of bushfires which killed 173 people. 9 days in that environment, I went through that 9 days, and it was sometime later that a really close friend sort of said to me, "Hey, Chris, who the hell are you? I don't know who you are." I was being pretty horrible to people. I didn't know it, but I was. And it was that friend that sort of shocked me into remembering and reflecting on all the experiences that I had, and that scared me.
We're all proud of this uniform. Sometimes we feel like Superman underneath it, but we're actually just normal, everyday humans.
You can get down and depressed and a bit angsty, and you can stay like that. It's hard to switch off. Like, even when you're driving home, you'd be like, oh, I went to an accident there, went to an overdose there, I did this there. Like, you see it all the time.
Across the agencies and across the general community, the stigma of talking about mental health has diminished, but it hasn't ceased. People are heroes, for want of a better term, but they are still human beings.
Mental health and well-being transcends all emergency services. It's something we all have in common.
Nobody remains unaffected, and for some people it's more difficult than others to be able to process it.
It's a community effort, and you know, it's just about looking after each other.
The Emergency Services Foundation is seeing that there's a gap, and they're going to fill that gap and do everything in their power to try and support the mental health and well-being of emergency services workers.
There is no one other than the Emergency Services Foundation that is actually taking a sector-wide approach to actually bringing together organisations. So I think there's a real benefit in collaborating, getting an organisation to bring us together, to share the things we do well and to learn from each other how we can do things better.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Tony Pearce. I'm the Inspector General for Emergency Management, and I'm also proudly the chair of the Emergency Services Foundation. The video you've just watched and the interviews you've just listened to that were so eloquently processed by John encapsulates our environment perfectly and the impact that it can have on the mental health and wellbeing of our emergency services and emergency management volunteers and paid staff. ESF's work is extremely important because, as Susan said earlier, we strive to have an impact early in the mental health injury cycle, and that is to initiate programs and resources aimed at preventing mental health injury. There are many organisations providing fantastic services to assist those already affected. However, there's little targeted at getting in early to reduce the potential of an injury, and that's where we at the Foundation believe the potential for us to provide the biggest benefit exists. The data shows, unfortunately, that there's a concerning growth in the prevalence of mental health injury across our sector, and this has been building for quite some time and will no doubt be greatly exacerbated by the current pandemic and the pressure that it is placing upon our frontline workers in particular. We're also in the enviable position as a foundation of being able to look at this issue through a sector-wide lens. We're not focused on individual organisations, and nor do we replicate any of the terrific work that's already been done by agencies. And as Tony Walker said in the video, we are the only ones approaching this from a sector-wide perspective, and we think there's huge, huge benefit in doing that. We're a small not-for-profit organisation that I think punches well above its weight, and we're extremely proud of what we do. As Susan said earlier, we drive evidence, innovation and leading practice in the sector. However, in the current economic climate, like a lot of other not-for-profits, we really do struggle for support, and that's an issue that we're continually trying to address to make sure that we can continue the work that we've started and I think are being so successful at delivering. So in closing, I'd like to thank our CEO, Susan McKenzie, and her very, very small team for pulling today's session together. It's just been fantastic. Thanks to John Sylvester for the terrific job of orchestrating the story and interviewing our guests. And a very, very, very special thanks to Deb, Jess, Sean and Joe, and to the many thousands like them out there on the front line protecting us all day in, day out. Without you, we would all be in a hell of a lot of trouble. So thank you so much for what you do. Finally, thanks to the more than 350 of you who registered for today's event, who have joined us today and to listen to the stories of the guys that we've just listened to on the interviews. And if you'd like to understand more about the work of the Foundation, please visit our website at esf.com.au. In closing, I just want to say have a great afternoon and please take care and stay safe out there. Bye-bye now.